Welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Teresa Warner, and I'm president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists. We are also a leading advocate for press freedom and a great defender of the First Amendment. Today, on World Press Freedom Day, we are joining with Freedom House to announce their findings of their annual survey of press freedom around the globe, Freedom of the Press 2012, Breakthroughs and Pushback in the Middle East. We have a great panel to discuss changes underway in various countries. But first, I would like to introduce Guido Westerwelle, the Foreign Minister of Germany. A lawyer by profession, Westerwelle has been serving as foreign minister in the second cabinet of Chancellor Merkel since October of 2009, and he was vice chancellor of Germany from 2009 to 2011. Today, I am pleased to introduce him to speak to us about the importance of press freedom.
Mr. Kramer, Ms. Werner, ladies and gentlemen, and excellencies, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great pleasure and a wonderful opportunity to address a few words of solidarity to you and to your work. I think on the occasion of the World Press Freedom Day, I would like first of all to thank you for your work and to encourage you to continue in this direction. And I'm delighted and honored that I could make it possible to come to you and to address a few words after your friendly invitation. I think, ladies and gentlemen, of course, in the era of internet, satellite television, smartphones, and social networks, in time of Facebook and Twitter, it may seem as if this finally had become a global and globalized reality. Unfortunately, this dream has only come true in parts of the world, not everywhere. We all know in Iran and elsewhere, censorship continues to oppress the free flow of information, to distort facts, and to change the perception of reality. Not only in Belarus, journalists still are behind bars for the mere fact that they act according to Article 19. As we speak, journalists have died, have been attacked, and risk being killed while reporting about the bloodshed in Syria. All that reminds us how heavy the responsibilities of journalists are and how precious and dangerous their daily work can be. Democracy is impossible without the freedom of expression and the critical assessment of state actions by a free and investigating press. And probably some people think the freedom of the press is just an issue for some academic elites. And I think it's not. Because without freedom of the press, we will not have freedom of expressions, we will not have freedom of opinion. And I grew up in a country where we were not used, in part of Germany, to the freedom of speech, freedom of expressions, freedom of press. And therefore, of course, my country feels a special responsibility to support your work and to support your engagement. I remember when I had been for my first time in Berlin. I grew up in the Federal Republic. I was born in '61. And I grew up in Bonn, which is the former capital city in the Rhine Valley. Probably some of you have been there. If not, please come. It's great. From my point of view, the most beautiful region in the world, except Washington, of course. But ladies and gentlemen, I remember when my father sponsored me when I was around about 13 years old, 14 years old, when my father sponsored me a trip to Berlin. In those days, the German nation was divided in two states. and Berlin was divided. There was the free part, so-called West Berlin, with the help and support of the American people and the GIs. This was the free part of Berlin and of Germany. And I was invited to go to the wall. And I remember there was a wooden platform. I was around about 13 or 14 years old. There was a wooden platform on the western side of the wall, and we climbed up and overviewed the wall. And behind the wall, we could not only see gray buildings. What we saw was the so-called death belt with mines in the sand. And this is not 19th century. This is part of my life, this is part of our life. And because Germany is so lucky that we are unified again, because our German reunification was also the European reunification, we feel a special responsibility to human rights, to civil rights, to the freedom of the people, freedom of opinion, expressions, and of course, of the medias and of the press. And always, in the world, wherever these human rights are attacked, the German government will clearly work against this and will clearly stand by the people and their democratic values. Democracy is the result of freedom, and democracy and freedom are two sides of the same coin. And therefore, we will continue to refuse to look the other way when journalists are persecuted and political opponents are oppressed. What we strive to achieve everywhere is particularly significant for millions of people throughout North Africa and the Middle East. With the Arab Spring, fundamental change has come to the Arab world. I have been after the revolution in Cairo 2 times on the Tahrir Square. It was an unforgettable moment for me to meet the people, the protesters, not only the young generation, many people were there, women, men, and they were so happy and delighted after the revolution that we really want to support them, that they stay on a positive way and in a good direction. People in the region, in particular the youth, had the courage to stand up for freedom, dignity, and participation. We will never forget the moving pictures from the Avenue Bourguiba in Tunis or the Tahrir Square, like I just mentioned, in Cairo. They showed us the power of freedom, and they taught us how quickly autocratic regimes can collapse in today's globalized world. Nobody knows what the wind of change blowing through North Africa and parts of the Arab world will ultimately bring about. However, we do know what a crucial role the media can play to overcome repression and violence. Thanks to the brave struggle of activists and journalists for a free press, today's international community is more than ever able to watch, to get information, to judge, and to act accordingly. The internet has revolutionized the media. Great new technological opportunities have changed information patterns dramatically. In our free society, that does not fundamentally change the rules of the game, not so in North Africa, the Middle East, and in other parts of the world. There, new forms of journalism play a crucial role in and for civil society. Without them, without Al Jazeera, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and others, it would hardly be possible for us to see and to hear and thus to know what is really going on in Syria, in cities like Homs, Hama, or Idlib. Maybe the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt had not succeeded without these new forms of journalism. Thus, the so-called Arab Spring has already written history, but we are still only at the beginning. The globalization, like we see now, is much more than an economic process. It is also a globalization of values. And this is the real change in the world, the globalization of values. It is the success story of values, what we have in our days. Freedom of the press, democracy, and the rule of law are far from being guaranteed. Most countries in the region are still relying on autocratic structures and media control. We must therefore carry on our struggle for a free press worldwide and for freedom of opinion worldwide. So, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, I'm very grateful that you gave me the honor to listen to me and to invite me. It is my opportunity to express how important we think your work is, and we want to encourage you with all our appreciation to continue and to do so your work in this direction. Thank you so much for your attention. Mrs. Lambert.
Thank you. He also said he was available for questions, so if anybody has questions, please raise your hand. When I call on you, if you would identify your name and who you are, who your publication is. Questions? This is an easy press conference for you. Oh, we got one right here. If you could state your name, please, and we have a microphone coming in your direction. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for your nice words, and thank you for being here. My name is Tom Dine, and I'm a trustee of Freedom House and have been in the press. I want to pick up on one thing you said, and I liked your expression, by the way, of globalization of values, a wonderful expression. So let's get back now to the specific. Syria. The Western world talks and doesn't do anything. People are getting killed every day. Our values have been wiped out, if you will, although hopefully they can always come back. Do you foresee the use of force in the coming days?
I think the international community, and not only the Security Council in New York, is really working on a political solution. And I couldn't agree more to what you said in your question. It was a question and also, of course, a remark. That the situation in Syria is really depressing all of us. The question is, how can we give answers? How can we find a solution? And we still think that the Kofi Annan plan is a chance, and we should work to implement this Kofi Annan plan. And I would like to invite you to look into the details of this Kofi Annan plan. These are 6 points. It's more than, of course, finish and the end of the violence and the withdrawal of the heavy weapons. It is also, for example, I think if I remember it correctly, in the 5th point, access of the media. Because the observers, they have a very responsible position for all of us, that we get really serious information and news. So I can only say I think a political solution is still possible. We should work on a political solution, and the German government wants to support the Kofi Annan plan and its implementation. This is what I can answer you at the moment. And of course, we all feel solidarity and sympathy. We shouldn't forget, like I mentioned in my little statement before, we shouldn't forget that thousands of people already have died, and among them hundreds of children. And it is, of course, sometimes frustrating if you sit in Berlin, in Washington, or in New York in the Security Council. You see what's going on, these atrocities, the repression, and it is also necessary, but it is necessary to work on a political solution, because we have two goals. The one is to protect the people, and of course, second is we do not want to see a war in the whole region in the sense of a really hot conflict for many other countries. This is what we have to prevent also.
Back here.
Hello, my name is Tom Reisen. I'm a freelance researcher. You mentioned East Germany. As you know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Stasi police records were unsealed, and people were able to know who was monitoring them, who was informing. Activists knew who was informing on them. The media knew who was informing on them. Now, in these Arab Spring countries, there's a lot of social media monitoring going on. There's a lot of network monitoring. So the records are not there. They're just looking at the networks. Do you think there'll be the same chance for accountability of media and free speech repression because of this?
Well, I'm hesitating to compare these both historic issues. What we see now in the region south of Mediterranean Sea and what we saw a bit more than 20 years ago in Germany and in the whole Eastern Europe. I'm hesitating because the situation is totally different. I mean, we are looking, for example, to people. I talked to the people on the Tahrir Square, and they asked for democratic participation and for social and economic participation. And I think this is also the key to develop this country. This is the reason why we in Germany started an initiative in the European Union, which we called a transformation partnership, which means more for more, but less for less. The idea is because we are using the wording Arab Spring, like I also did. But if we want to differentiate, if we look into the countries, to the different countries, we all know there probably are Arab seasons, but not an Arab Spring. So the situation in Morocco is totally different if we compare it to Tunisia or to Egypt, or just look to Algeria or to Libya, and then I'm just in north of Africa. And there are many others, many other countries. So I wouldn't say that we can give lessons about the management of the history like we had in Germany, because the situation is really from country to country, each country to each country, very different. This is my point. And if you allow me just to make one little remark, you said what everyone says worldwide, the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is what I many times use as a wording, but if we are looking back, people of my generation, we remember the wall didn't fall. There were people who stood up and they broke the wall. And this makes it different, only with one instrument, only with one tool, with their clear will and identification for freedom. I think this is probably the best tool what you can have as a citizen in your hand.
This is Thomas Gorgisian from Tahrir newspaper, Egyptian newspaper in Egypt. Sir, you mentioned the word that inspiring moments and all these kind of human history and all these glory words. But the reality now is completely different, and as you said, it's seasons. But I'm not trying to make a compare and contrast between each other, but I'm just trying to ask you one question. What your country, Germany, with all the experience that they have and the resources they have ready to do to keep that spirit up, first, to make it reality and transfer to a democratic and civil nation, not a military-ruled country.
I think this is exactly the concept of the transformation partnership, and because you are working for an Egypt media, you know exactly the discussion in the European Union. This is exactly the idea of our engagement in Egypt and in the other countries, of course. But if you, with all modesty, let me just say, from my point of view, Egypt is the key country. Egypt is the key country, not only because of Cairo. Egypt is the key country for many things else. And therefore, for example, together with my American colleague, Hillary Clinton, we started to make it possible that, for example, foundations, our political foundations, can continue their work. If we want to be successful, this is really one of the lessons of our history. If we want to be successful with a democratic process, we need a strong civil society. And this includes political education. Not in the sense that we want to bring our religious values to other religions. Of course not. But in the sense that we think political education for the young generation is necessary. Training of journalists, young journalists. I mean, you know them, 17, 18, 20, 25 years old. I met them. And because of the last decades, they do not know what we know, how free medias can work and what power they have if they work seriously and sensible and responsible, of course. So I think it's a comprehensive approach what we have. It's an economic support, but it's also the idea to strengthen the civil society, because the stability of a country is not the result of the stability of an autocratic government. The stability of a country is the result of the stability of the society. And the society is what counts. Long answer, but a complicated question. Well, then thank you so much. I wish you all the best. Thank you for your hospitality, and I hope to see you soon again, and good luck for your discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I would like to introduce the moderator for today's panel discussion, Mona El-Tahawi. She is a New York-based award-winning columnist and an international public speaker on Arab and Muslim issues. She is a columnist for Canada's Toronto Star and Israel's The Jerusalem Report. Her opinion pieces have been published frequently in the Washington Post and the International Herald Tribune, and she has appeared as a guest analyst in several media outlets. Before she moved to the US in 2000, Ms. El-Tahawi was a reporter in the Middle East for many years, including in Cairo and Jerusalem as a Reuters correspondent, and she reported for various media from Egypt, Israel, Palestine, Libya, Syria, Saudi Arabia, and China. Her public speaking has taken her around the world, and we are pleased that she is with us today. I'm going to turn things over to Mona to introduce the panel.
Thank you, Teresa. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank Freedom House for bringing us here together to discuss these very important issues on World Press Freedom Day. But before I introduce the panel, I would like to recognize David Kramer, the president of Freedom House, and also Will Taft, the chairman of the board. So good morning to you both. And I'm going to keep my talking to very limited sentences to introduce our panel, basically, so we can get right down to things. Our first speaker today is Courtney Ratch, who is the program manager for the Global Freedom of Expression campaign at Freedom House. She's an international media expert with more than 10 years of journalism and new media experience in the US, Middle East, and Europe. And she is currently finishing her dissertation on cyber activism in Egypt. She's doing her PhD at the American University here in DC. So welcome, Courtney, and we'll start the panel with you.
All right, well, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the editor of our Press Freedom Survey, Karen Carlicar, is doing an event in Mexico, so I'm going to have the privilege to share with you some of the findings from what turned out to be a very momentous survey this year, the Freedom of the Press Survey 2012, Breakthroughs and Pushbacks in the Middle East. For the first time in 8 years, the negative trend that we've seen with the declines in freedom of expression around the world was stayed, and we actually saw some slight uptick and improvement, in large part due to gains in the Middle East. Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, all went from not free to partly free, which was a pretty momentous change. And we also had countries like Burma that came out from under incredibly oppressive political rule. And what we've seen is that of the 197 countries and territories that we assessed in 2011, including the newest country of South Sudan, a total of 66, or 33.5%, were rated free, 72, or 36.5%, were partly free, and 59, or 30%, were rated not free. So this balance shows a shift towards the partly free category, and it sounds like there's about a third of the population in each category, or a third of the countries in each category. But when you look at the population, it's a bit more dire. We found that only about 14.5% of the world's inhabitants live in a country with a free press, where they can express themselves, they can be economically independent, the press is economically independent and free from political interference. And this is, of course, incredibly disturbing. And it actually declined to its lowest point since 1996, when we began tracking population data. And as the German foreign minister mentioned in his remarks, new forms of journalism have become incredibly important. And so we've taken this into account in our methodology. And we are taking into account the role that citizen journalists and informal means of journalism play in creating a free press environment. And in terms of regional trends, as I mentioned, some of the most dramatic gains were driven by openings in countries in Middle East and North Africa, as well as the Asia-Pacific region. But they were unfortunately nearly balanced out by negative movements in the regional averages for Central and Eastern Europe, Eurasia, and the Americas. And we also saw that despite positive news in countries like Egypt and Tunisia, that there has been backsliding since the report covers the calendar year of 2011, but just today, actually, on World Press Freedom Day, we got news that Tunisia, the Tunisian courts have found Nesma TV guilty. We've also been denied entry, Freedom House has been denied entry into Bahrain to conduct a freedom of expression assessment mission that we were supposed to do with Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Sans Frontières, and PEN International. And of course, my colleague from Egypt is here to talk about the situation there. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the situation Freedom House is facing there. So unfortunately, what we see is that many of the gains in the levels of freedom this year in the Middle East and North Africa are negative freedoms, not positive freedoms. They emerged because there is a lack of rule of law, there are a lack of some of the legal structures and regulatory structures that restricted press freedom, and a lack of political interference. But as we've been seeing this year, that seems to be turning. And what we need to do is consolidate those gains and turn them into positive freedoms by putting them into the Constitution and into the laws and regulatory structures, and ensuring that politicians don't interfere in freedom of the press. So with that, I'll conclude.
Thank you very much, Courtney, for your very succinct and to-the-point presentation. I appreciate that, because time is not on our side today. Our next speaker, on the panel is Nancy Al-Kuwari, who is the country director for Egypt for Freedom House. Many of you might know her from a now iconic photograph in the New York Times, in which she stood in a cage along with other defendants reading homage to Catalonia, very apt for what was happening to her and the other defendants in the NGO trial in Egypt. Nancy has worked with both the Egyptian government and non-governmental organizations. She was with the Ministry of International Development in Egypt, and then with pro-democracy NGOs before she left for the UK, where she earned a PhD in international development. And so I now present defendant number 34, as she is known. And you will notice that her necklace is a necklace that she designed herself with the cage in which the defendants stand, and the number 34 is written on. Nancy, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mona. I think you've said enough. Right. Well, as you've all seen from the report, that Egypt has been upgraded from not free to partly free in the freedom of the press for 2012. But as Courtney indicated, this mainly covers the calendar year of 2011. And this means that this gain or upgrade was mainly tenuous, just as everything else we've seen after the inspiring moments that we've witnessed at the beginning of the revolution, after the euphoria of the first 18 days of the uprising, which ended by the fall of Mubarak. Well, maybe I would just try to be brief, but I would just like give you an overview of how the status of the media and the press in Egypt now, on two grounds. First, the legal framework, and second, the operating environment and the actual practices. So concerning the legal framework, well, by the Constitution, the article entails that everyone is entitled for freedom of speech and freedom of expression. But when it comes to laws, this is when the problem begins. I mean, because this is what entails, I mean, like what is incriminated, what is criminalized or not. So, for example, shortly after we've seen the formation of the first cabinet after the revolution, in September 2011, we've seen that the Prime Minister issued a decree that criminalizes any act of criticism of the government or the Supreme Council of Armed Forces. Of course, the language of this decree was very loose, so you cannot really identify what is considered as a criticism or insult or what would be criminalized or not. So this is on the legal side. On the practical side and on the operating environment, we've seen at the beginning also a lot of hope with the establishment of new media outlets, new independent voices coming out and taking different milieus, and we've seen new voices coming on the television, on the talk shows, and we also the establishment of new channels, and we've seen also an opportunity with several newspapers are getting licenses to start publication, which was not the case before the fall of the Mubarak regime, or maybe Mubarak, just to be precise, not the Mubarak regime itself as a whole. But this was short-lived. I mean, this did not continue, and very soon we've seen that those who are in authority, or those in power and overseeing the transition, were not very tolerant of the opposition voices. And we've seen this intolerance in different forms. We've seen it on immediate censorship, where we've heard members of the Supreme Council of Armed Forces calling presenters and talk shows on air and telling them off because they are criticizing the practices of the SCAF or their attitude. We've seen presenters and journalists summoned to military prosecution offices. Some were formally charged, or some were called for a cup of tea, and we all know what this means. So there are different forms of intimidation and cracking down on journalists. Again, we've also seen a crackdown on many bloggers who were detained and imprisoned. Some of them are very prominent ones. We've seen the case of the famous case of Ali Abdel Fattah, who's a blogger, that because he refused to be prosecuted under the military framework or the military prosecution, he was punished and he was detained for over, I think, 3 months. And after that, I mean, at the end, he won the battle, at least for being prosecuted under a civil prosecution. The other thing is that we also seen, like, as Mr. Foreign Minister of Germany, that no one will forget the inspiring moments of the Tahrir Square, where the people are like expressing their views and very active in just combating that regime. But also we can never also forget moments when we saw military soldiers work with machine guns getting into studios where the presenters are on air. Actually, that was last October when the Maspero events, where there was a crackdown on the sit-in of the cops in front of Maspero in Cairo. So I mean, it's like, as you see, I mean, like in the overall picture, there were a lot of optimism at the beginning, but then soon we saw that there is an intolerance for criticism and opposition, and mainly media, which is the most important tool that the previous regime had and keep on using. And of course, we are directly affected by this, and civil society in Egypt was directly affected by this, because starting June 2011, we saw a huge media campaign defaming civil society and criminalizing their work. So this smear campaign turned out to be a pretext for the prosecution of civil society organization that came afterwards, and we were personally involved in it. Just what is happening, and the way I see it, is that this is a classic way of any regime that is trying to crack down on opposition. Is basically, it's a form of isolating the country. And they do this in two ways. First of all, isolating the country by preventing international community members, whether journalists or observers or witnesses, to come into the country. So this is one way, in not issuing licenses or not issuing visas for them. And the other way is to foment fears internally against those foreigners, projecting them as, or portraying them as spies or as agents of foreign countries trying to implement foreign agendas to instigate violence and create instability in the country, which translates at the end as an overall sense of xenophobia in the country, and leads the citizens themselves attacking or harassing anyone who is foreigner with a camera. And we've seen this several times happening in Egypt. So there are different forms of the classic way of any regime to isolate the country by preventing foreigners from coming inside and fomenting fears inside towards those foreigners. Because this is the biggest fear of any regime, is this international attention. I mean, at the time of Mubarak, you could have vented as much as you liked locally, and as long as it's in Arabic, yeah, maybe sometimes you were given a warning and summoned for a cup of tea again at the state security, but as long as it's internal, it was in a way tolerated just to keep a face of being democratic. But as soon as this goes out to the international media, as soon as it's in a language that speaks to the international community, this is what they fear the most. And that's why this is our hope, is that to continue reaching out to the international community and communicating our message from inside, but also learning from the practices and the professionalism of media and journalism outside of the country. And just to end on a more optimistic note, is that as much as there is the crackdown, and as much as it's very, very difficult now for any journalist to express their opinion freely, and just 2 minutes ago, actually on Twitter, a cartoonist was detained in Abbasiyah as we speak because he was holding a cartoon picture of the victims of the violence that erupted in the past 2 days, and he was detained, and they are trying to find lawyers to get him out. So as much as this is happening, but the hope is that the ones who are in power now are still in the older mindsets and the older tools that they have. I mean, they keep recycling those tools, and they very quickly run out of them. Where they are opposed on the other side by very young, vibrant generation that are very creative. They invent ways every day. For example, there's a famous campaign that they launched by citizen journalists called Kazibun, or Liars, which is like basically having videos of the atrocities that have been committed by those in authority in Egypt since the fall of Mubarak and until today. And because they know that social media does not reach everyone in Egypt, and because we have a very high level of illiteracy in the country, they take those videos and go to every district in Egypt, in every governorate in the south and in the north, and try to show those videos and get people around them and gather them and respond to questions and raise awareness about what's happening. So as much as there is a crackdown, I still have hope on the creativity of this young generation that does not run out of tools, as opposed to the ones who have the same tools that they have in their hands. So that's it.
Thank you, Nancy. Our next speaker is Margarita Torres from Mexico. For those of you who follow the news, you have followed the sad news, I'm sure, over the past few months of the deaths and assassinations, often of many journalists in Mexico, including just 2 days ago of a well-known female journalist. So Margarita works at the Universidad Ibero, okay, my Spanish is non-existent, at a university in Mexico City, where she teaches and coordinates the program, the Latin American program for the right to information. She specializes in ethics in journalism, the right to information, and professionalism in journalism, with an emphasis on challenges in these areas during periods of violence. So Margarita, you have 5 minutes to catch us up on what's happening in Mexico.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. As you may know, Mexico, well, in the Freedom House report, is considered a not-free country for second year. And this is mainly because of the violence we are living in the country. I would like to start saying that the silence of the journalists is also the silence of the society. And this is what we are facing right now. In certain areas of the north of the country, near the border, there are places where journalists just cannot do their jobs. Their lives are at risk almost all the time. And it's, last Saturday, we received this very sad news that the correspondent of Revista Proceso in the state of Veracruz was murdered in her house. She was covering social issues. So we are facing a lot of, I also work in an organization of journalists, and we realize that we are facing a lot of challenges. Mainly is the aggressions and the killings, also the violence. And with the violence, there's something that is happening. Journalists are in danger because they are covering the violence, but they are also target of the violence. So this has taken us to establish, to consider certain areas of professionalization that journalists need. And this is the physical security, digital security, and also emotional security. Because of the atrocities. Some newspapers have established specific editorial criteria to covering the violence, to covering the war against the organized crime, but in certain areas this has moved to the self-censorship, and this is very dangerous for everyone. One of the other things that is very difficult to determine, and a lot of reports of the state of the media in the country has established is that we are not pretty sure who is the enemy of journalists right now. And it's very difficult to determine, because in some cases is the organized crime, in other cases is the local authorities. So at certain moments it's very difficult to do the job, and of course to do the investigative journalism. We have, on Monday, a new law was approved. It's the law to protect journalists and human rights defenders in the country, but we are pretty sure that the law will not be enough if the impunity is not ended in the country, because we also had a special mechanism to protect journalists, and it started working. It's supposed to be work for, I think, 2 years, and still we don't have results. So our main issue is that we need a guarantee of the work of the journalists, but mainly because we need the information, the quality of the information for citizens to face the challenges of the situation that we are having in the country. I think that would be like the main issues I want to point out about the situation of in my country, and also another subject that it's very important for us, at least in the organization where I work, and is to promote that the coverage of the victims that now is in the agenda of the media, and it starts a year ago. But we need, as society, also we need to know what are the faces and what are the voices of the victims that this violence is creating, because well, we are right now we are in an electoral year. So this will be very important if we want to promote the democracy and the enforcement of the democracy in our country. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Margarita. I think what you said about Mexico is also a reminder of something that the German foreign minister said, which is the deliberate targeting of journalists that we're seeing, especially in countries like Syria, where bearing witness to what happens on the ground is such an important role. And that's exactly why journalists are targeted, because those in power and those who want power don't want that power of bearing witness. And I think it's something to remember as we look not just at the world generally, but especially at the countries struggling for these various revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa. So thank you for that reminder. Our last speaker on the panel today is Andras Kosa from Hungary. He's the head of the Domestic and Foreign News Department for hvg.hungary, an online newspaper in his country. Prior to working with this online newspaper, Andras was the deputy editor-in-chief of well, my Hungarian is even worse than my Spanish, a news website. And before that, he worked as a journalist for the Hungarian political daily newspaper, Magyar Hírlap, which I'm sure I've massacred, where he covered domestic and foreign politics. So Andras, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah, okay. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. And thanks for the opportunity to have this morning with you. Well, actually, luckily, doing my everyday job, I don't have to face such a serious problems that my colleagues mentioned, so I don't have to afraid of physical repression. I don't have to afraid of detention. But unfortunately, Hungary was a country of the Freedom House survey that became that backlashed from the free to the partly free category as a member of the European Union, actually. And as 20 years ago, maybe some of you remember to it, my country was the leading force of the whole democratic transition of Europe, actually. Now, unfortunately, in my opinion, in the last 2 years, it started to head to a very different way. Since our problems concerning media freedom are mostly political and legal, let me just have a few sentences, give you a broader context of it. So in 2010, we had the last elections, and Fidesz, a conservative party, gained a supermajority, a two-third majority in the parliament. And since then, they use, and I can tell you in many cases, they abuse their power, actually. So they eliminated the checks and balances of the political system. They created a brand new constitution without the opposition, and they put their own members, so former Fidesz members, in many various very important national institutions like National Audit Office, the Budgetary Council, the Public Prosecutor, or, for example, the leading body of the jurisdiction. Sorry, actually, the last one was actually a wife of a Fidesz leader. So, they changed the legal framework actually of the media and passed through the parliament into very controversial media law, which one of them is created actually a new authority, the National Media Authority. The leading of this authority is a former Fidesz member as well. He is nominated, he is appointed for 9 years with a 2/3 majority, and he has a very broad competence actually. And there is the other body, the Media Council, that is consists of 5 nominees, all of them delegated from the Fidesz actually, so without the support of the opposition. And these 2 bodies have a very broad authority concerning the media. By the original version of the law, for example, they should fine, they should levy a very huge fines if they thought a media coverage is so-called unbalanced. For example, these fines could reach as, I would tell it in dollar actually, so the maximum for a national circulated daily newspaper or an online newspaper like my one, so the maximum fine could have been $120,000 actually, so which is very huge counting the Hungarian circumstances. Well, luckily, last December, the Constitutional Court lifted some part of this act and revoked the media authorities' right to make such a fines in online and print media outlets. But it's still, they have the competition to find the televisions, for example. Last year, actually, the nominees of the Fidesz took over the public media, the public radio, the public television, and the National News Agency. And at the same time, they dismissed more than 1,000 people from these. And because of the so-called budget cuts, but in this year, for example, they allocated 10% more money actually to this public medium than it was before. Because of this huge dismission and the new leaders, so there is a strong mood for self-censorship for the journalists and editors of the public medium. That could drive them some very ridiculous situations actually. So that happened last year, that there was a news coverage about a conference, and one of the previous chief jurisdiction leader appeared there, and personally, one of the leaders of the public television didn't like him, so he asked actually to the editors to blur his face from the coverage. So, and protesting against it, some editors and journalists of the national television went to a hunger strike, and they were dismissed, of course, as well. The other big problem is concerning the radio frequencies. Actually, for example, I can tell you just one small example because I know my time is more or less over. So there is a radio station, it's called Club Radio, which is famous for its harsh critics of the government. And their frequency, radio frequency, expired at the end of 2010. And from that time, they get just a 3-month temporary license from time to time, which makes their job actually very, very hard. And the media body launched a new tender for this frequency, but not for a commentary, not for a politically actually oriented radio, but for a mostly music oriented. So I think there is a kind of intention behind it that they would like to silence the critical voices towards the government. Well, that's it at the moment, and I'm happy to answer your questions. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Andras. I'd also like to salute all our panelists for their courage and for their continued advocacy in the case of Courtney and Nancy, but in the case of Margarita and Andras, pushing for greater press freedoms in the most challenging of times. And these are issues that are very close to my heart personally and professionally, because some of you might know that in close to Tahrir Square last November, Egyptian riot police broke both my arms and sexually assaulted me, and I was detained for 12 hours by the police and the military. So these are issues that touch many of us very closely. So I salute you all for your wonderful and courageous work. And now, keeping an eye on the clock, where I have a plane to catch and I'm the moderator, so I get to boss you around. I'm going to open the floor to questions now, but I would urge you to keep your question under a minute, because if you don't, I will stop you. Because we would love to hear your questions, comments. Make them questions, please, so that I can put them to the audience, the panel, sorry. So, first question, who wants to set us off? Okay, I see a gentleman right here. Is there a mic that will go to him? Please identify yourself and who you're affiliated with, and if there's a person you direct your question to, tell them.
Yes, thank you very much. András Szörényi from the Embassy of Hungary. I would like to thank you and the organizers for this panel, and Mr. Kósa for the comments. Unfortunately, I feel obliged to make a short remark at the beginning. Namely,
under a minute, or I will stop.
Under a minute. And the remark is very short. I would like to ask Freedom House, whose work we appreciate a lot, to pay attention to not base the report on factual mistakes and incorrect legal interpretations, because it's not part of the methodology they describe. But unfortunately, there are several in the report. And that just to answer or to ask Mr. Kósa, two of the examples you mentioned are factually incorrect. For unbalanced coverage in the Hungarian media law, you cannot be fined. I urge everybody to read the legislation. And Klub Radio entered the bid, they lost in Hungary, and there is a procedure in court, which is part of the rule of law, which is ongoing, so there's no final decision yet. And then the question, under 1 minute, how do you describe the role of the partly free media in the resignation of the president based on a scandal, a very reasonable one, launched by your online newspaper, if I can remember correctly? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for advertising my newspaper, actually, at first. Well, for the first remark, I think it's not my job to answer it, but actually, I didn't mention that I just checked the news before I came here in my hotel room, and actually the Undersecretary charged for communication made some very harsh comments, actually, about the Freedom House news survey. So it caused a very big, it caused actually huge waves in Hungary. So you made a good job. So okay, well, actually, so I mentioned in my small speech that in some part of the law was lifted by the Constitutional Court, but actually I can tell, I need to tell you, I just checked the homepage of the National Media Authority, and they still have the old version of the act on their homepage. So maybe it's their job to refresh it now. And yeah, okay, so your question. Well, okay, of course, we could raise these stories. So just in a few words, we raised the story that our president, or now our former president, copied almost 100% of his doctorate, and that caused a very raised a very big political scandal, so he finally had to step down. Well, I can tell you, we raised it very clearly, so we didn't have to face any problem with it. Actually, I think it's not the part of the story that I've spoken about. So journalists can work free circumstances, more or less, in independent journals. On the other side, actually, is that, for example, state-owned companies advertising just in some certain radio stations, certain TV stations, certain newspapers who are in favor of the government, and some opposition journalists are lack of this opportunity. So, but to give you a short answer, we could work freely actually on this story, so it wasn't a problem. Thank you.
And maybe I could just address something about the report, just to clarify. I mean, Hungary was on the very edge of free. It was at 30 and moved down to 36 to partly free. And that reflects a general decline in the Hungarian media environment due to the impact of legal and regulatory changes introduced in 2010. But we know those impact can take a time to have effect. And also, you mentioned that one of the laws is still a draft law, but I can tell you, as a journalist who used to work in the United Arab Emirates, when a press law was introduced that would have imposed serious fines and jail time on journalists, even though it remained a draft law, it nonetheless had a very important impact. And I actually lost my job because of an article I wrote. And we know that laws have an impact both when they're in place, but also when they're being discussed. Certainly, if you believe that there are factual errors, we're happy to consider those, but this is a pretty rigorous methodological study that we do, and I think that it's great for us to hear that the governments are looking at this and that you care, because we also care. The reason that we do this survey is to raise awareness about what democratic governments and non-democratic governments can do to improve their press freedom environment. And so look forward to continuing that discussion with you later.
Just a very short remark, actually, sorry, by the end. So you all know actually that the expression, if there is a gun on the stage, actually, one time it will be used. So I think in more or less the situation could be comparable to Hungary. So actually, there are these two media regulatory bodies with a huge competence, which haven't been used in a full scale yet. But there is the opportunity to be used, actually. Thanks.
Okay. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, please. I see, yes, the gentleman at the back. Thank you.
Hello. I have a question about the blogosphere in Mexico.
Could you let us know who you are, please?
I'm Tom Reisen. I'm a freelance researcher.
Thank you.
And about the blogosphere in Mexico, you mentioned that self-censorship has been an issue because of the gangs and because of the violence in Mexico. How do you see the role of the growing blogosphere in Mexico as a counterpart to some of the newspapers that have faced repression and threats?
Yeah, well, I think there are different perspectives because, for example, websites like Blog del Narco, there's Blog of the Narco, arise, and we are not pretty sure who is behind the blog, but it start working as an alternative source of news, linked with the drug cartels and the violence in certain areas of the country. But I would prefer to talk about what is the social media doing in Mexico. In certain areas, cities, because of the silence the journalists and the media were forced to, the citizens start using social media to report what was happening in their cities. And it became, and it is, a source of information of the journalists right now. Journalists still needs the, sorry, I can see the guy who, no, it's okay. journalists need the tools to verify the information, but what is happening in social media is very important because it's helping journalists as a source of information. Other issue that is happening it's not in all the country, but in certain areas, and I want to be very emphatic in this, is that also, for example, in Veracruz last year, two persons were accused of disturbance of the public, I'm sorry, it's like the public order, because something they tweeted. And they were accused and they were in jail, and then the governor gave a step back, but it is an issue right now because it's changing the process. It's changing how citizens are communicating among each other because of the violence in certain parts of the city. It's also becoming a source of information of the journalists, and it's also generating certain kind of alarm in the authorities, because at the end we want to understand what is going on, and citizens are trying to use different sources and different ways to know what is happening. And also, well, something happened last year that it's certain bloggers and users of the social networks were intimidated by the organized crime. So it's a very complex situation, and in the Mexican case, we will have to check it like a part by part, because it's not the same thing what is happening in the north, it's not the same thing what is happening in the south, it's not the same thing that is happening in Mexico City. So if you want, I can give you more information about that, but it's very complex what is happening. Actually, in the indicators of how many journalists have been killed last year, there are certain numbers are different because of who is considered a journalist, and some consider the blogger and others don't. But yeah, that is and it's a real challenge. In my first intervention, I'll talk about the professionalization of journalists, and we are considering also the digital part, because it's a tool. Of course, we know that it's a very new tool, and all the journalists must learn how to use social media and all the digital tools, but how to use it, how to consider it when covering the violence. So it's a very interesting issue. I hope I answered your question.
Thank you, Margarita. Any more questions? Yes, I see here a hand, and I see Thomas as well, so we'll start with you.
Santiago Tabra from Notimex, Mexican news agency. This is a question about the United States, the condition of the freedom of the press. You mentioned in your report a lack of diversity and lack of protection of sources. I don't know if you can comment on that.
Sure. One of the challenges here in the United States is the economic consolidation and the increasingly dire economic situation for newspapers in particular, the closure of independent outlets. And we still lack a federal shield law. There are some states that have shield law, which essentially allows a journalist to protect their sources. But we've also seen attempts to create legal mechanisms and use, for example, some of the anti-terrorism laws as a way to get information from journalists. And so, I think one of the things that our survey underscores is that, especially in the case of Hungary and the United States, is that even consolidated democracies face challenges in protecting freedom of expression and freedom of the press. And as you know, our survey looks at the entire environment. So it looks at the political, legal, and economic environment, because it really is about the media ecosystem that presents a free press. In some cases, it's attacks on journalists that cause press freedom to decline, and in other cases, it's the decline of the economic conditions that support a free press.
Okay, I think we have time for two more questions. So I saw a hand over here, Thomas, and then I see the young woman over there, and I think that will do
Thomas Gorgisian, Tahrir newspaper. Margarita raised the issue of who is the enemy of media these days. I mean, and That's a good question to be asked, and I'm not trying to answer, but I'm trying to mention one of the things that beside the authorities are other factors, as in the case of the Arab Spring, is like the Islamist or nationalist, super nationalist, whatever, and they are trying to oppress that freedom of expression. At the same time, Margarita said that there is a worry about the self-censorship and the silence of the journalist. And Nancy mentioned the issue of international awareness and the isolation of isolating the country. How Freedom House can avoid or meet these challenges?
Well, Freedom House, as you know, produces this annual survey, which is some of our analytical work done out of our New York office. But we also have a significant element of programming. We do programming around the world in Egypt and the Middle East, as well as every other region in the world. And I myself run our program, Freedom of Expression campaign. And one of the things that we do is provide support to local activists and groups on the ground that are promoting freedom of expression. We help build their capacity to advocate on the issue at both the national and the international level. So helping them figure out how to use, for example, UN mechanisms and other mechanisms that will help strengthen international norms to make it more difficult for governments to restrict freedom of expression and create this isolating situation. And you know, we do trainings, we do support. We have obviously on our website several details, but one of the unique things about Freedom House is that we do the analysis, we do action, which is programming on the ground, and we do advocacy. And so we really think that taking this comprehensive triangulatory approach to promoting free expression and democracy and human rights around the world, we hope will help improve the situation.
Okay, and for our final question, the woman here on the side. Do you have a mic? Excellent.
Hi, my name is Sasha Scott. I'm an independent producer, and I had a question for Dr. O'Kale. I was hoping you could talk a little bit more about your personal experience with the situation and maybe the toll it's taken on your family to do the kind of work that you do. And I was wondering, even in free media, the US media, for example, do you feel like you're able to sufficiently tell your story in a way that a reader really understands, let alone if you were able to do that in Egyptian media or elsewhere in the Middle Eastern media? And how can even a free press cover your story more adequately to where you feel like people have all the information they need to know about your story? Thank you.
Thank you. Of course, on the personal level, I mean, it took a toll on me and my family, but I always would like to remind everyone that this is not just me. There are 14 Egyptians that stand in the cage back home, and they are the finest of Egyptian youth. And well, in addition to Robert Becker, who's the American who remained back there, the trouble is that at the beginning, when we were first summoned for interrogation and prosecution, I can speak for myself. I was glad to just go and stand my case, and because we were very confident that we are innocent, we did not break the law in any ways. But at the same time, you're operating in an environment that is not governed by a rule of law. It's a very much still an impunitive culture with many threats and risks, and you don't know really. You don't have a clarity about your rights, and you don't have a clarity about the process that you're going through and where it starts and how it ends. So this uncertainty is the most fearful thing that we go through. We are subject to several means of harassment, and not just because of the legal case, but also there are other things that happens on the side that on a daily basis that really makes it hard to live normally. Like for example, one day after we knew that we were indicted, which we knew about through Twitter, by the way, not through formal means, I found people calling me, it's like, we saw your name on Twitter that you're being indicted in a legal case. But after that, one night we found that all the people on the list had their names, their personal home addresses, and ID numbers, and very specific information published on a website. So this is very scary. You can imagine, I mean, what kind of threat this puts when you have at the same time, I mean, this information published, and at the same time state media portraying us as spies, and we're conducting acts of espionage, and what this may entail. So, and the fact that we don't know when this process is going to end, how it's going to end, and our lives are just hanging there. Myself and another fellow defendant in the cage were considered the oldest of the 14. The rest are just in the beginning of their 20s and just beginning their careers. Some of them were not even working on any political issues. They were finance officers or accountants, and their career will basically be jeopardized by any kind of conviction, even if it's a fine or a suspended sentence that is like good enough to just end their career and their future, let alone how this is affecting their reputation with the rest of the population. Maybe the community of civil society in Egypt understand the situation, and they have been suffering as well as much as we are suffering from what's going on. But the rest of the Egyptian public basically get their information mainly from the state-controlled media, I mean, which is defaming us and portraying us again as spies. So, I mean, in their communities, I mean, they are harassed and threatened and subject to all sorts of risks. As for access to media, I've been fortunate, especially when I came here to the US. I've been having like access to some very prominent media outlets, and I had an opportunity to tell my story, not because it is about me, but it's about, I mean, the ways things are in Egypt right now, because not everyone understands what is going on inside the country. I'm trying to also conduct some advocacy work on Capitol Hill and speak to some of the policymakers and to raise awareness about the issue, because when high-level officials visit the countries, and I'm not speaking just about Egypt, but all the countries in the region, just by the fact that they are going on an official mission, by default they would be meeting the officials. And this is the story they hear. They don't usually get to hear the story of the activists or the people on the ground and how they suffer. So being here, telling the story, having access to international media is like, I'm not just doing this for myself, but also for the rest of the people in the case, and also for the future of civil society in Egypt, because, I mean, this case is not targeted at just those particular individuals in the cage, but mainly as an example to create a chilling effect for the rest of the Egyptians, and whoever would dare to follow that path and conduct any democracy and rights advocacy work. So.
Thank you, Nancy. I think it's important to remember that Nancy chose to stand trial because she could have left Egypt before she had to enter that cage at the beginning of the trial. So for that, I salute her even more, for her courage and for her solidarity with her fellow defendants. Now, some of you might know that I'm quite a fierce feminist, so I'm very glad that this is one of the few panels that you'll see where there are more women than men. So for that, I salute Freedom House. And in the name of that fierce feminism, I'm going to take one more question from a woman, because we have had some inequality regarding the questions. So there is a woman, I believe, under the light over there who has a question. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Caroline Crouch from Georgetown, and I just had a question. You've mentioned several times restrictions on bloggers who are getting arrested, or we see sort of the effects after they've been blogging. I was wondering about capabilities in these different cases to actually do restrictions from the technological side. Are you seeing websites being blocked? Is that possible in a lot of these situations? How is that playing out on Facebook and different places like that?
Are you interested in globally or mainly in Egypt?
In Egypt in particular.
Okay, because just to throw this out there, we have a separate report called Freedom on the Net, which looks at specific countries in depth on their level of internet freedom, which includes access, surveillance, censorship. Egypt is one of those countries, but why don't you take that?
Well, yes, I mean, there's continuous crackdown on all those outlets and ways to just not just cut those means, but also monitoring them and also harass the bloggers online. We have something that is very familiar in Egypt called the Electronic Committee, which was basically formed at the time of the NDP. It was a formal committee that basically formed of like high-tech kind of individuals who harass bloggers or people from the opposition online and pretending, creating fake accounts and harassing people and putting like misinform the people about the intentions again of those bloggers and who they belong to and the opinions they present. But at the same time, we get like very creative, young generation that try to always get around those means of curtailing their ability to access the internet. And we also need to remember that when the Mubarak regime completely cut off any communications, internet, mobile phones in the 18 days, at the beginning of the 18 days of the revolution, this actually had an adverse effect. They were stupid enough to do that, so people actually went to Tahrir Square more to see what's going on. So it's just when there is a will and when there is this creativity and a need for the people to really stand up for their rights to express themselves and have the freedom of expression. It's very hard to, you can limit that for a time, but it's not sustainable. It's just like you always find ways to go around it. And so also it helps when there's an international community watching over what's happening. And this is the biggest support that is needed, actually.
Okay, thank you very much to all our panelists, and thank you in the audience for your questions and for your interest. And I wish everybody a wonderful World Press Freedom Day. Thank you.
Is my opportunity to express how important we think your work is, and we want to encourage you with all our appreciation to continue and to do so your work in this direction. Thank you so much for your attention. Mrs. Daniel.
Thank you. He also said he was available for questions, so if anybody has questions, please raise your hand. When I call on you, if you would identify your name and who you are, who your publication is. Questions? This is an easy press conference for you. Oh, we got one right here. If you could state your name, please, and we have a microphone coming in your direction. Yes.
Hello. Thank you for your nice words. And thank you for being here. My name is Tom Dine, and I'm a trustee of Freedom House and have been in the press. I want to pick up on one thing you said, and I liked your expression, by the way, of globalization of values, a wonderful expression. So let's get back now to the specific. Syria. The Western world talks and doesn't do anything. People are getting killed every day. Our values have been wiped out, if you will, although hopefully they can always come back. Do you foresee the use of force in the coming days?
I think the international community, and not only the Security Council in New York, is really working on a political solution. And I couldn't agree more to what you said in your question. It was a question and also, of course, a remark. That the situation in Syria is really depressing all of us. The question is, how can we give answers? How can we find a solution? And we still think that the Kofi Annan plan is a chance, and we should work to implement this Kofi Annan plan. And I would like to invite you to look into the details of this Kofi Annan plan. These are 6 points. It's more than, of course, finish and the end of the violence and the withdrawal of the heavy weapons. It is also, for example, I think if I remember it correctly, in the 5th point, access of the media. Because the observers, they have a very responsible position. for all of us that we get really serious information and news. While reporting about the bloodshed in Syria. All that reminds us how heavy the responsibilities of journalists are and how precious and dangerous their daily work can be. Democracy is impossible without the freedom of expression and the critical assessment of state actions by a free and investigating press. And probably some people think the freedom of the press is just an issue for some academic elites. And I think it's not. Because without freedom of the press, we will not have freedom of expressions, we will not have freedom of opinion. And I grew up in a country where we were not used, in part of Germany, to the freedom of speech, freedom of expressions, freedom of press. And therefore, of course, my country feels a special responsibility to support your work and to support your engagement. I remember when I had been for my first time in Berlin. I grew up in the Federal Republic. I was born in '61. And I grew up in Bonn, which is the former capital city in the Rhine Valley. Probably some of you have been there. If not, please come. It's great. From my point of view, the most beautiful region in the world, except Washington, of course. But ladies and gentlemen, I remember when my father sponsored me when I was around about 13 years old, 14 years old, when my father sponsored me a trip to Berlin. In those days, the German nation was divided in two states. And Berlin was divided. There was the free part, so-called West Berlin, with the help and support of the American people and the GIs. This was the free part of Berlin and of Germany. And I was invited to go to the wall. And I remember there was a wooden platform. I was around about 13 or 14 years old. There was a wooden platform on the western side of the wall, and we climbed up and overviewed the wall. And behind the wall, we could not only
Welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Teresa Warner, and I'm president of the National Press Club. We are the world's leading professional organization for journalists. We are also a leading advocate for press freedom and a great defender of the First Amendment. Today, on World Press Freedom Day, we are joining with Freedom House to announce their findings of their annual survey of press freedom around the globe, Freedom of the Press 2012, Breakthroughs and Pushback in the Middle East. We have a great panel to discuss changes underway in various countries. But first, I would like to introduce Guido Westerwelle, the Foreign Minister of Germany. A lawyer by profession, Westerwelle has been serving as foreign minister in the second cabinet of Chancellor Merkel since October of 2009, and he was vice chancellor of Germany from 2009 to 2011. Today, I am pleased to introduce him to speak to us about the importance of press freedom.
Mr. Kramer, Ms. Werner, ladies and gentlemen, and excellencies, thank you so much for inviting me. This is a great pleasure and a wonderful opportunity to address a few words of solidarity to you and to your work. I think on the occasion of the World Press Freedom Day, I would like first of all to thank you for your work and to encourage you to continue in this direction. And I'm delighted and honored that I could make it possible to come to you and to address a few words after your friendly invitation. I think, ladies and gentlemen, of course, in the era of internet, satellite television, smartphones, and social networks, in time of Facebook and Twitter, it may seem as if this finally had become a global and globalized reality. Unfortunately, this dream has only come true in parts of the world, not everywhere. We all know in Iran and elsewhere, censorship continues to oppress the free flow of information, to distort facts, and to change the perception of reality. Not only in Belarus, journalists still are behind bars for the mere fact that they act according to Article 19. As we speak, journalists have died, have been attacked, and risk being killed, just mentioned in Cairo. They showed us the power of freedom, and they taught us how quickly autocratic regimes can collapse in today's globalized world. Nobody knows what the wind of change blowing through North Africa and parts of the Arab world will ultimately bring about. However, we do know what a crucial role the media can play to overcome repression and violence. Thanks to the brave struggle of activists and journalists for a free press, today's international community is more than ever able to watch, to get information, to judge, and to act accordingly. The internet has revolutionized the media. Great new technological opportunities have changed information patterns dramatically. In our free society, that does not fundamentally change the rules of the game. Not so in North Africa, the Middle East, and in other parts of the world. There, new forms of journalism play a crucial role in and for civil society. Without them, without Al Jazeera, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and others, it would hardly be possible for us to see and to hear and thus to know what is really going on in Syria, in cities like Homs, Hama, or Idlib. Maybe the revolutions in Tunisia and Egypt had not succeeded without these new forms of journalism. Thus, the so-called Arab Spring has already written history, but we are still only at the beginning. The globalization, like we see now, is much more than an economic process. It is also a globalization of values. And this is the real change in the world, the globalization of values. It is the success story of values, what we have in our days. Freedom of the press, democracy, and the rule of law are far from being guaranteed. Most countries in the region are still relying on autocratic structures and media control. We must therefore carry on our struggle for a free press worldwide and for freedom of opinion worldwide. So, ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, I'm very grateful that you gave me the honor to listen to me and to invite me. We see gray buildings. What we saw was the so-called death belt with mines in the sand. And this is not 19th century. This is part of my life, this is part of our life. And because Germany is so lucky that we are unified again, because our German reunification was also the European reunification, we feel a special responsibility to human rights, to civil rights, to the freedom of the people, freedom of opinion, expressions, and of course, of the medias and of the press. And always, in the world, wherever these human rights are attacked, the German government will clearly work against this and will clearly stand by the people and their democratic values. Democracy is the result of freedom, and democracy and freedom are two sides of the same coin. And therefore, we will continue to refuse to look the other way when journalists are persecuted and political opponents are oppressed. What we strive to achieve everywhere is particularly significant for millions of people throughout North Africa and the Middle East. With the Arab Spring, fundamental change has come to the Arab world. I have been after the revolution in Cairo 2 times on the Tahrir Square. It was an unforgettable moment for me to meet the people, the protesters, not only the young generation, many people were there, women, men, and they were so happy and delighted after the revolution that we really want to support them, that they stay on a positive way and in a good direction. People in the region, in particular the youth, had the courage to stand up for freedom, dignity, and participation. We will never forget the moving pictures from the Avenue Bourguiba in Tunis or the Tahrir Square, like I